100,000 soldiers refused to fight. France on strike. The 1917 mutiny that saved an army. They were supposed to be executed. Instead, something unexpected happened, something that changed everything. This is the story nobody talks about. Subscribe for more untold World War I stories that rewrote history. When soldiers stop fighting, empires must listen. In April of 1917, something unprecedented unfolded across the French trenches along the Chemin ridge. General Robert Nivelle had promised a breakthrough, a decisive victory that would end the grinding stalemate of the Western Front. On the 16th of April, tens of thousands of French soldiers advanced into what they believed would be their moment of triumph. Instead, they encountered reinforced German defenses, devastating machine gun fire, and the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare. By the 25th of April, when the main offensive was suspended, the casualty lists told a story of catastrophic failure. The promised breakthrough never materialized. The ridge remained in German hands. But something more dangerous than military defeat had taken root in the minds of exhausted men. They had been lied to. They had been sent to die for an illusion. What happened next shocked the French High Command and threatened to unravel the entire war effort. Rather than accept another senseless slaughter, soldiers began refusing orders, not with violent rebellion, but with quiet, disciplined defiance. They would hold the line. They would defend France. But they would not attack. They would not die for the vanity of a general whose strategy had collapsed into nightmare. This wasn't mutiny born from cowardice. It was resistance rooted in the desperate mathematics of survival. And it would force France to confront truths it could no longer ignore. The preliminary operations had begun in early April, 1917. French forces under General Robert Nivelle's command moved methodically across the terrain near Saint-Quentin, capturing German defensive positions in what appeared to be a promising opening gambit. The Third Army advanced with measured precision, and for a brief moment, optimism flickered through the French High Command. This offensive, they believed, would be different from the grinding attrition that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives since 1914. Nivelle had promised a breakthrough. He had promised victory. He had promised it would be swift. But promises made in gilded headquarters often die in the mud. On the 16th of April, 1917, the main assault commenced along the Chemin ridge, a rolling plateau north of the Aisne River, where German defenders had fortified their positions with meticulous German engineering. The weather was deteriorating. Spring rains had turned the battlefield into a treacherous landscape of mud and flooded shell craters. The preliminary bombardment, intended to shatter enemy defenses, had instead alerted the Germans to the coming offensive. They reinforced their lines, deepened their trenches, and prepared counterattacks with cold precision. The French soldiers who went over the top that morning carried the weight of 3 years of war. They had survived Verdun, where nearly 300,000 of their comrades had fallen. They had endured the Somme, where the combined British and French casualties exceeded 1 million. They had lost friends, brothers, and fathers to artillery, machine guns, and poison gas. Yet still they climbed out of their trenches, fixed bayonets to their rifles, and advanced across no man's land toward German positions that seemed impregnable. The casualties mounted with horrifying speed. By the 4th of April, as preliminary operations concluded, French forces had captured German defenses near Saint-Quentin, but at tremendous cost. Thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded in the spring mud. Then came the main offensive. The Chemin ridge proved far more formidable than intelligence reports had suggested. The German defense was stubborn, methodical, and devastating in its efficiency. French regiments that went in at full strength emerged reduced to scattered platoons. Company commanders found themselves leading handfuls of men. Battalions ceased to exist as coherent military units. The promised breakthrough never materialized. Instead of shattering the German lines in a decisive blow, the French army found itself engaged in the same brutal, attritional warfare that had defined the entire war. Nivelle's grand strategy, the plan that was supposed to restore movement to the Western Front, had collapsed in the first days of implementation. Soldiers could sense it. Officers could feel it. The offensive had failed, and yet the killing continued. By the 25th of April, 1917, just 9 days after the main assault began, the French High Command suspended the primary offensive. They had committed enormous resources, sacrificed over 130,000 soldiers, and achieved nothing but a longer casualty list. The official military record would later acknowledge approximately 187,000 French casualties during the entire operation, including nearly 29,000 killed and 4,000 captured. The Germans suffered approximately 163,000 casualties of their own, including between 15,000 and 20,000 prisoners. The mathematics of slaughter had been calculated, and both sides had paid a terrible price for minimal territorial gain. What happened next, however, was unprecedented in the annals of modern warfare. The soldiers, exhausted beyond measure, traumatized by years of futile sacrifice, and deceived by promises of victory that never materialized, began to refuse orders. This was not mutiny in the traditional sense, with organized revolutionary cells or political agitators orchestrating rebellion. This was something far more organic and dangerous, a spontaneous collapse of discipline born from the simple human recognition that they could not continue. Regiments began to refuse to return to the front lines. Soldiers sat down and would not advance. Officers found their orders ignored. Soldiers sang revolutionary songs. Some expressed solidarity with the Russian Revolution, which had erupted just weeks earlier with the overthrow of the Tsar. Others simply refused because they could no longer endure the senseless slaughter. The contagion of refusal spread through the French army with astonishing velocity. By late May and early June of 1917, the mutinies had infected as many as 54 divisions across the French army. This was not a minor disciplinary problem that could be addressed through court-martial and execution. This was a systemic breakdown of military authority affecting more than half the entire French army. The general staff was in crisis. The political leadership in Paris was in turmoil. The question that haunted every senior commander was simple and terrifying. What happens when an army stops fighting? The implications extended far beyond the French army. Britain was counting on French participation in the Western Front. The Germans, observing the chaos with intelligence reports from their agents, recognized an opportunity. If the French army collapsed entirely, the burden of containing German forces would fall entirely on the British and American forces. The war could be lost, not through military defeat, but through the simple refusal of soldiers to continue dying for objectives that seemed increasingly meaningless. The French government and military faced an unprecedented challenge. They could not simply suppress the mutinies through mass executions, as that would only deepen the crisis. They could not ignore the soldiers' grievances, as those grievances reflected genuine failures of strategy and leadership. They needed a solution that would restore discipline while simultaneously addressing the legitimate concerns of the troops. They needed someone who could command respect not through fear, but through reputation and the promise of change. That solution would arrive in the form of a new commander, a general who had earned the trust of the French people through his role in the defense of Verdun. But before that transformation could occur, the mutinies would spread further, the crisis would deepen, and the very survival of the French army would hang in the balance. The question of how one general and a series of strategic reforms could restore discipline to a broken army, and how that restoration would ultimately save France from defeat, would define the next chapter of this extraordinary story. The stage was set for transformation, but first, the breaking point had to be reached. The suspension of the offensive on the 25th of April marked not an ending, but a beginning of something far more dangerous than any German counterattack. General Robert Nivelle had promised his government a breakthrough. What he delivered instead was catastrophe wrapped in official silence. The casualty figures arrived at headquarters like a hemorrhage that would not stop. 130,000 French soldiers had fallen in the first 9 days of fighting along the Chemin des Dames ridge. The breakthrough never came. The German lines, battered but unbroken, held firm. By late April, the strategic failure was undeniable, yet the official narrative remained unchanged. The offensive would continue, the victory was near, the sacrifice would be justified. In the trenches and rest billets across the French sector, the soldiers understood the truth before their commanders would admit it. They had seen the same promises before. In 1916 at Verdun, General Philippe Pétain had thrown 500,000 men into the furnace of attrition. Verdun had not brought victory. It had brought only the slow, grinding death of industrial warfare. Now in 1917, with the war already 3 years old, the men who survived those battles were being asked to believe in Nivelle's promised breakthrough. The difference was subtle but absolute. The soldiers' faith had broken. The mutiny, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion, but a slow collapse of obedience. It began in early May, with small acts of resistance. Soldiers refused to move forward to the attack positions. Officers reported that men were abandoning their weapons and walking away from the line. In one regiment, soldiers sang the Internationale, the workers' anthem, as they marched toward the front. In another, men simply sat down and refused to move. What made these acts revolutionary was not their violence, but their organization. This was not panic or individual cowardice. This was collective action, coordinated across multiple divisions, spreading like fire through dry grass. By the beginning of June, the mutiny had engulfed up to 54 divisions of the French army. Entire regiments refused orders. Soldiers declared they would defend their positions if attacked, but they would not participate in any further offensive operations. One soldier wrote to his family, preserved in the archives now at Vincennes, "We are not traitors to France. We are soldiers who have done our duty, but we will not throw our lives away for the ambition of generals who sit in comfortable headquarters." The letter was intercepted, but it expressed what thousands were thinking. The men had reached the limit of what they could endure. The military hierarchy responded with confusion and then with fear. General Nivelle, the architect of the failed offensive, attempted to maintain control through force. Military police were dispatched to suppress the spreading disorder. Soldiers were arrested for refusing orders. Courts-martial were convened. Yet each execution, each arrest, seemed only to deepen the resolve of the mutineers. The crisis threatened to tear apart the entire French army at a moment when Germany still possessed the capacity to launch devastating counteroffensives. It was in this atmosphere of impending collapse that the French government made its crucial decision. On the 15th of May, General Nivelle was removed from command. His replacement was General Henri-Philippe Pétain, the same commander who had presided over Verdun and who had declared, "They shall not pass." Pétain understood something fundamental that Nivelle had missed. Soldiers are human beings, not automata. They can be driven so far, but there is a point beyond which they will break, not from cowardice, but from the simple recognition that further obedience means certain death for objectives that cannot be achieved. Pétain's approach was revolutionary in its moderation. He did not attempt to suppress the mutiny through terror alone. Instead, he implemented a series of reforms that acknowledged the soldiers' grievances while maintaining military discipline. Furloughs were increased, allowing men to see their families. Rest periods were extended, food rations were improved, communications with home were facilitated. The frequency of leave was doubled, a concrete recognition that men who had not seen their families in months had legitimate needs beyond the demands of warfare. Simultaneously, Pétain maintained the iron discipline necessary to prevent complete collapse. Executions were carried out, though in smaller numbers than the official records suggest. Court-martials continued, but Pétain was selective. He did not execute entire units or apply punishment indiscriminately. Instead, he focused on ringleaders while offering amnesty to those who returned to duty. The message was clear. The army would restore order, but it would do so in a manner that recognized the soldiers' humanity. The tactical response was equally important. Pétain announced that large-scale offensive operations would cease. The French army would shift to a defensive posture, holding ground while waiting for the arrival of American forces, whose entry into the war in April 1917 promised eventual numerical superiority. This announcement, more than any speech, restored confidence. The soldiers understood that they would not be thrown into futile assaults. Their role would be to hold the line, to survive, to wait. Through May and into early June, the mutiny gradually subsided. Soldiers returned to their duties. The regiments that had refused orders came back under control. By the end of June, discipline had been fully restored. The crisis had passed, yet the cost was significant. The French army had lost its capacity for large-scale offensive operations for months to come. The initiative on the Western Front would pass to other armies. The strategic consequences would ripple through the remainder of the war. The casualty figures from the offensive itself told the story of its failure. The French had suffered approximately 187,000 casualties, including 29,000 killed and 4,000 captured. The Germans had lost approximately 163,000 men, including 15,000 to 20,000 captured. These were enormous numbers, yet they had not produced the breakthrough that Nivelle had promised. The offensive had been suspended on the 25th of April, but the mutiny that followed would occupy military and political attention for the remainder of the spring and early summer. The political consequences were equally profound. Nivelle's failure damaged the credibility of French military leadership. The government in Paris had staked its reputation on his promises. The mutiny was a public relations disaster, revealing to the world that the French army was on the verge of collapse. The German high command learned of the mutinies and briefly considered a major counteroffensive to exploit French weakness. Only German supply problems and the need to transfer divisions to other sectors prevented a catastrophic attack on the weakened French lines. Yet there was a hidden strength in what appeared to be France's darkest hour. The mutiny demonstrated something that the generals had not fully appreciated. The soldiers were not mindlessly obedient. They had limits. But those limits, once respected, could be extended. The men who mutinied in May and June 1917 were the same men who would hold the line when the Germans launched the massive spring offensive of 1918. They were soldiers who understood what they were fighting for, not because they had been ordered to understand, but because their government and military leadership had finally treated them as human beings. The transformation was not complete or permanent. Discipline remained harsh. Mutineers faced severe punishments. The official records were doctored to minimize the extent of the rebellion. For decades, the French government denied that the mutiny had ever occurred, treating it as a shameful secret. Yet the reality persisted in the memories of those who lived through it, in the letters and diaries preserved in archives, in the oral histories passed down through families. Pétain's success in restoring order without destroying the army's fighting capacity was a masterclass in military leadership under impossible circumstances. He recognized that the 1917 mutiny was not a moment of weakness to be crushed, but a warning signal that could not be ignored. The soldiers were not refusing to defend France. They were refusing to participate in operations that had no reasonable chance of success and would only add to the already catastrophic casualty rolls. By early July, the immediate crisis had passed. The French army remained a viable military force, capable of holding its lines and supporting its allies. The offensive that had begun with such promise on the 16th of April had become a symbol of the war's futility. Yet from that failure and the mutiny that followed emerged a different kind of strength. The French soldier, having confronted his limits and found them respected, became paradoxically more reliable, more determined to hold what could be held, more willing to endure what must be endured. The turning point, therefore, was not a moment of triumph, but of transformation. The 1917 mutiny did not save France through military victory. It saved the French army by forcing its leadership to acknowledge a fundamental truth. Soldiers are not machines. They can endure suffering, sacrifice, and danger when those demands are justified. But when the demands become unjustifiable, when the promised rewards dissolve into more casualties and more failure, then even the most disciplined army will break. Pétain understood this. Nivelle had not. In that understanding lay the difference between a general who could restore an army to fighting capacity and one who had nearly destroyed it. The silence that descended upon the French trenches in late April 1917 carried a weight far heavier than artillery. Where machine gun fire and artillery barrages had once been the constant language of the front, now came something more unsettling. The sound of soldiers refusing to speak the only language their commanders understood. The mutinies that had begun as whispered complaints among exhausted men transformed into a coordinated rejection of authority that would reshape the entire war effort. By the 1st of May, 1917, the crisis had become undeniable. General Nivelle, whose reputation had been built upon promises of breakthrough and decisive victory, found himself watching those promises crumble not under German fire, but under the collective will of his own men. The preliminary operations that had claimed thousands of lives in early April had failed to produce the promised advantage. The main offensive launched on the 16th of April on the Chemin des Dames ridge had devoured over 130,000 French casualties in its opening weeks, yet the German lines remained largely intact. By the 25th of April, the offensive was officially suspended, its strategic failure undeniable. What followed was not resignation, but revolution. The mutinies began in isolated units and spread with frightening speed across the military landscape. By early June 1917, military authorities estimated that approximately 54 divisions had been touched by the wave of refusal and protest. These were not cowardly retreats or panic-stricken routs. These were organized, deliberate acts of collective resistance by men who had endured 3 years of mechanized slaughter and recognized that Nivelle's promised miracle was merely another variation on the same feudal theme. The soldiers articulated their demands with remarkable clarity. They would not return to the trenches to conduct further offensive operations under the existing command structure. They would defend their positions against German attacks. They would hold the line. But they would not be led into the meat grinder again by generals who had learned nothing from the catastrophic failures at Verdun and the Somme. The mutinies represented something profound and historically significant. Soldiers drawing a line between obedience and self-destruction, between military discipline and basic human survival. The response from the high command was swift and dramatic. General Nivelle, whose strategic vision had precipitated the crisis, was removed from command. His replacement arrived in mid-May. General Philippe Pétain, the aged warrior who had earned his reputation through meticulous defensive strategy rather than grandiose offensive schemes. Pétain was 71 years old, a figure from an earlier generation of military thinking. Yet his appointment proved to be precisely the intervention the moment demanded. Pétain understood something that Nivelle had fundamentally failed to grasp. An army cannot be driven indefinitely through hopeless offensives without eventually breaking. The mutineers were not traitors or cowards. They were rational men responding to irrational leadership. Pétain's first action was not mass executions, though military courts would eventually sentence approximately 50 men to death for their role in the mutinies. Instead, Pétain initiated a comprehensive program of reform that addressed the actual grievances driving the unrest. Leave policies were reformed to ensure soldiers received regular rotation away from the front lines. Rations were improved. Living conditions in the trenches were enhanced. Most crucially, Pétain issued orders strictly limiting offensive operations during the remainder of 1917. The new strategy was explicitly defensive in nature. France would hold its lines, consolidate its positions, and wait for the American expeditionary forces to arrive in sufficient numbers to tip the balance decisively. This was not the strategy of glory and breakthrough, but it was a strategy grounded in realistic assessment of the military situation. The political consequences rippled through the French government and society. Nivelle's fall from prominence marked a broader shift in how the war was being conceptualized by the French leadership. The illusions of rapid victory that had sustained public morale through 1916 had been shattered by the Nivelle disaster. By the summer of 1917, France was exhausted. The American entry into the war in April 1917 had provided hope, but that hope was tempered by the knowledge that American forces would require months to mobilize and deploy in meaningful numbers. The mutinies also exposed the class tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of French military culture throughout the war. Officers, many drawn from aristocratic backgrounds or from the professional military class, had been insulated from the worst horrors of trench warfare through rotation policies and rear area assignments. Enlisted men, drawn from working class and peasant backgrounds, bore the overwhelming burden of casualties. The mutineers were not revolutionaries in the Bolshevik sense, though conservative military authorities certainly feared such connections. They were professionals exercising a form of labor resistance against conditions they deemed unacceptable. By the end of June 1917, military discipline had been restored under Pétain's regime. The mutinies had subsided, though the underlying tensions that had caused them remained present throughout the French army. Approximately 50 soldiers were eventually executed for their role in the mutinies, though many more received lesser punishments or were quietly reintegrated into the service. The exact number of executions remains contested by historians, with some evidence suggesting higher figures, though the most reliable sources indicate that judicial executions numbered in the range of approximately 50, with many other sentences commuted or reduced. The human cost of the entire Nivelle Offensive was staggering. French casualties totaled approximately 187,000, including approximately 29,000 killed and 4,000 captured. German casualties in the same period numbered approximately 163,000. These figures represented enormous expenditures of human life for minimal territorial gain. The promised breakthrough never materialized. The war ground on into its fourth year with no end in sight. Yet from this catastrophe emerged an unexpected consequence that would ultimately prove significant to the Allied war effort. The mutinies and the reforms they prompted prevented the complete collapse of French military capability at a critical moment. Had Pétain not implemented his defensive strategy and his reforms, had the executions been more numerous and the concessions fewer, the French army might have fractured entirely in 1917. The Russian armies had already begun their own process of dissolution in 1917, leading ultimately to the Bolshevik Revolution. A French army collapse would have left the Western Front in a state of profound vulnerability. Instead, the French army survived as a functional military force, albeit one no longer capable of major offensive operations in 1917. The British and American forces would bear the primary burden of offensive operations in the final year of the war. The French would hold their sector of the line, prevent German breakthrough, and provide crucial support to the broader Allied strategy. This was a diminished role compared to the ambitions of 1916 and early 1917, but it was a role that the French army could fulfill. The legacy of the 1917 mutinies extended far beyond the immediate military circumstances. For subsequent historians and military analysts, the mutinies represented a watershed moment in military history. They demonstrated that even in the context of total war, soldiers retained agency and the capacity to resist orders they deemed suicidal. The mutinies challenged the prevailing assumption that military discipline operated through fear and punishment alone. Pétain's reforms suggested that military effectiveness could actually be enhanced through attention to soldier welfare and through limiting objectives to those that were strategically sound. In the decades following the war, the mutinies became a subject of intense historical scrutiny and considerable political controversy. Conservative military authorities emphasized the dangers of military indiscipline and the necessity of harsh punishment to maintain order. Progressive historians and political figures highlighted the legitimate grievances of the mutineers and the failures of leadership that had provoked the crisis. The mutinies became a lens through which different ideological perspectives examined the nature of military authority and the limits of obedience in warfare. The personal stories of individual soldiers who participated in the mutinies were often lost to history, obscured by the larger military and political narratives. Yet scattered documents, letters, and later testimony provide glimpses into the experiences of ordinary men who found the courage to refuse orders. These men were not revolutionaries in the Bolshevik sense, though some may have been sympathetic to left-wing political ideas. They were primarily practical men responding to practical circumstances. They had seen enough death. They had endured enough suffering. They understood that Nivelle's promised breakthrough was an illusion, built on the same failed logic that had produced the slaughter at Verdun. For the German military, the mutinies in the French army provided an intelligence windfall. German intelligence services monitored the crisis carefully and understood its implications. The reduction in French offensive capability meant that German forces could maintain their positions along the Western Front, with fewer resources committed to that sector. However, German military leaders also understood that the crisis was temporary. The arrival of American forces would eventually overwhelm any advantage Germany might gain from French difficulties. The German response was to accelerate their own strategic planning, resulting in the massive Spring Offensive of 1918, which would represent Germany's last genuine attempt to achieve victory before American resources tipped the balance decisively against them. The American expeditionary forces began arriving in France in significant numbers during the summer of 1917, precisely as the French mutinies were being suppressed and Pétain's reforms were being implemented. The American forces would gradually assume an increasingly central role in the military operations of 1918. The French and British armies, both severely depleted by years of grinding attritional warfare, would increasingly take supporting roles in the final campaigns. This represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the Allied coalition. By the end of 1917, the Western Front had settled into a pattern of relative stability that would persist through most of 1918. The French held their sector, the British held theirs, and American forces gradually expanded their operational area. The great offensives and counteroffensives that had characterized the earlier years of the war gave way to more limited operations designed to hold ground and inflict casualties on the enemy without risking complete military collapse. This was not the kind of warfare that military strategists had anticipated in 1914, but it was the kind of warfare that the exhaustion of the belligerent nations had made inevitable. The mutinies of 1917 and the reforms they prompted ultimately served to stabilize the French war effort at a critical juncture. General Pétain, despite his later controversial role in collaborating with Nazi Germany during the 1940s, made decisions in 1917 that prevented military catastrophe. By recognizing the limits of what exhausted soldiers could endure, by implementing reforms that addressed legitimate grievances, and by adopting a defensive strategy that was strategically sound, Pétain transformed a potential military collapse into a stabilized front that could be held until American resources arrived in overwhelming quantity. The French soldiers who participated in the mutinies accomplished something historically significant through their refusal to obey. They did not end the war, and they did not prevent the final year of grinding combat that would claim hundreds of thousands more lives. But they did prevent the complete destruction of the French army in 1917. They forced military authorities to acknowledge that soldiers were human beings with limits, that strategy must be grounded in realistic assessment of capabilities, and that military authority itself was ultimately dependent upon the consent of those being commanded to obey. History would record the mutinies as a moment when the French army nearly collapsed under the weight of 3 years of grinding attrition. Yet, history would also record that the army did not collapse. It reformed, it adapted, and it endured. The soldiers who refused orders in 1917 were not the last to resist suicidal military strategy, nor were they the first. But their actions at a critical moment in the First World War prevented a catastrophe that might have altered the entire trajectory of the war and the subsequent course of European history. As the guns fell silent on the 11th of November 1918, the surviving soldiers of the French army could reflect on what had been endured and what had been accomplished. The war had claimed approximately 1,400,000 French lives, a catastrophic toll that would shape French society and politics for decades to come. Yet the nation had survived. The army had held. The line had not broken. In large measure, this was because, in 1917, ordinary soldiers had found the courage to say no, and because military and political leadership had possessed the wisdom to listen. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you spending time with these incredible World War I stories. If you enjoyed learning about this pivotal moment in history, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a video. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What was the most surprising thing you learned today? Drop your ideas down there because your perspective matters. And trust me, there are so many more fascinating stories from the Great War waiting to be told. From the trenches to the home front, we're just getting started. So keep that curiosity alive